The previous three videos were devoted to utility maximization from the graphical perspective, the mathematical perspective, and then an example. We have derived the result of this at the end in this example in terms of Marshallian demand functions. Now what we do is to analyze what can happen to the result if income or prices change. So that's basically a comparative statics exercise where we take the result of utility maximization and analyze how this result depends on the underlying parameters. In this, we first focus on normal goods, which is kind of the standard case that you observe very often in microeconomic examples. And we will discuss some non-standard cases such as inferior goods and given goods in later videos. And we also first focus on the main intuition with a graphical analysis and discuss the underlying income and substitution effects that we observe in case of these changes and the channels by which they affect demand in later videos in more detail. So we will lay the foundations here from an intuitive perspective and we'll discuss these effects later on in more detail. The first case, assume we have normal goods and a certain optimal choice. So we have the budget constraint and we have the indifference curve that is attention to the budget constraint at this consumption point here, where we have the dotted lines that indicate consumption of good 1 and consumption of good 2. And now we have the situation that the budget that is available to the consumer changes. So the case that we consider here is an income increase or a budget increase, so that the person who chose this consumption point before has then more money available to spend on the two goods after this budget increase. So what would happen then? Well, the budget line would shift outwards away from the origin, because now the consumer can afford more goods of the first type, so more goods 1 and more goods 2. So we have an increase in the available budget, an increase in the feasible set. That means in terms of utility maximization that the consumer is able to reach an indifference curve that is farther away from the origin, and therefore utility, felicity, satisfaction, and whatever you want to call it, would increase. In this case then, for these normal goods, the consumer would consume more of good 1, so this would increase from here to here, and more of good 2, which would increase from here to here, the consumption of this good. And that's the case for normal goods. If incomes rise, then consumption of the goods would increase. Now consider that it's not the income that changes, the available budget, but the price. And here we assume that the price of good 2 decreases. So what we would have in this case is then a rotation of the budget line around the point where it intersects the x-axis, because the price of the good 1 does not change. So we can, if we spend all the budget that we have on good 1, the consumption amount does not change. But since the price of good 2 falls, we can buy much more of good 2 if we spend all of our budget on this good 2. So the budget line would rotate, in this case clockwise, around the intersection with the x-axis. In this situation, there are now two cases that can emerge. The first case is depicted here, where we have the situation that the consumer can buy more of good 2, which the consumer does, but the effect on the consumption of good 1, that's ambiguous a priori. Why? Because due to the fact that the price of good 2 decreased, the consumer can overall buy more of the two goods later on. So that's the income effect that we will discuss later on in more detail. But at the same time, there is a substitution effect, because the price of good 2 decreased while the price of good 1 stayed constant. So the consumer would want to shift consumption from the good where the price stayed the same to the good where the price decreased. And in this case here, the income effect dominates. So the consumer would consume more of good 1 for which the price did not change, because the income effect is greater than the substitution effect in this case. However, it could also be the case that the substitution effect dominates. Then we would be in a situation like this one here. So the budget constraint, the change in the budget constraint is exactly the same as in the previous graph, but the preferences are a little bit different. And in this case, we would end up with the indifference curve here as the indifference curve that is the one associated with the highest utility level. And in this case, consumption of good 1 would actually decrease, while consumption of good 2 increases. And in this case, the substitution effect dominates. So the price of good 2 decreases, and this would attract so much consumption from the other good that the income effect that emerges due to the price decrease, where the consumer can afford more of both goods, is more than compensated by this substitution effect. So to summarize, for normal goods, consumption would increase when income increases. For inferior goods, that's not the case, and they will be discussed in a later video. But for normal goods, that's the case. And then for normal goods, when the price of the good decreases, then consumption of this good rises. For given goods, that would not be the case, but given goods will also be discussed later. And when the price of one good decreases, then the consumption of the other good may either rise, which is the case when the income effect dominates, or fall, which is the case when the substitution effect dominates. And both of these cases can emerge for normal goods. And income and substitution effects will also be discussed in more detail in a later video. Thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you found it interesting and useful. For more videos on economic content, please visit my channel that you find here to the left. And to the right, you see the next video in the series at the top, and at the bottom, you see the whole lecture in the form of a playlist.